Why do Black women have so many more fibroids, or is more likely to have be affected by fibroids and endometriosis and PCOS? Without the research, we will never be able to answer these questions. It is always so good to see you ladies back on the virtual couch. Yay! Oh my goodness, Dr. Black, it is always a joy to have you on the couch with us. And we have a very serious conversation to have this evening. I could not wait to have this conversation because I'm not sure I have an answer for it. And Dr. Triss, is always, I know you saw the topic for this evening, and I know you got things to say, okay? The topic that we're going to talk about this evening is representation in clinical trials. Mm-hmm. And talking about the fact that the percentage of specifically Black Americans is so low, and Hispanic Americans and Asian Americans, but especially Black Americans, is so low in clinical trials. There is a historic context to this. Yes. We've talked about different aspects of the historic context of why Black people don't want to be in trials, don't want to be tested, don't want to be tried. But on the other hand, there is such an importance to have representation. Part of the issue that we're having when it comes to medications and treatments is the fact that we don't have sufficient information to really understand the Black physiology or the Hispanic physiology or the Asian physiology when it comes to different aspects of medicine. So it is a catch-22. Now, when you first became aware of the percentage of participation of minorities in clinical research, and you may have noticed this even in your training, because I know I did, what was your first thoughts? Either one of you. What was your first thoughts? We want to know.
Why should we?
Well, one of my first thoughts were, where are the people of color in this aspect? And there were a lot of questions in regards to if it's applicable and actually how to use that, specifically in a clinical field, the psychology field of administration and research. How do we actually apply this position to a demographic that is not represented? I had a lot of curious questions, some in silence and some verbally, but it was definitely an absence that's probably always recognized by people of color rather than the majority.
Yeah, I think you're 100%, I know you're 100% right, because I had the same thoughts. And I remember thinking that one of the first things they teach us when it comes to looking at research, whether you are in the in psychology or whether you're in the physical therapy field, whether we're in women's health field or in pulmonology, when we all look at research and research studies, we look at exactly what you were mentioning, Dr. Black, the generalizability of the study. And so one of the things that's really important is looking at the study group and saying, can I apply the findings of this study to this population, to that population? And oftentimes when we would read research, one of the things that would catch my attention is we are so, especially in medicine specifically, we are so inflexible about the results of study and applying it to others. So for example, what I mean by that is when a patient comes up and they say, you know what, when I take this medication, my arm tingles. But guess what? That's not listed as a known side effect. And so clinicians are so adamant about that doesn't make any sense because it's not a known side effect. And I think we lack the consciousness to constantly apply, well, how much do we know about this drug in this particular population that this patient represents? And so one of the struggles for me is this adamant or this confidence about our clinical information and our findings and trying to apply it to population, making patients feel like they're out of their minds because they're having the symptoms. They know they're having this particular symptom. They know they feel this way. Them being told that doesn't make sense.
Mm-hmm. And just to parry on that, Dr. Moore, like I will be honest, if what I've heard from patients in coming for therapy, if what I've heard from them is, well, that doesn't make sense, it's not a known side effect, I would be okay with that. What I hear them repeating more is, no, that's not causing that, with
Mm,
such certainty
yes.
that no, that's not causing that. It may not be, but they never leave room for there to be any kind of question. No, that's not causing that. And it's like they dismiss them. And so now you have the patients coming thinking, I can't trust my body because I don't know what my body says. You do know what your body says. Anyway,
Right,
back to the
right.
topic at hand. I digress. I
No,
digress.
no, no. That is the topic, because I think that's part of the struggle, and that's part of the frustration from the patient's perspective, because that adds to the distress with when it comes to healthcare. That adds to the distress of medicine because they don't feel heard. And that's something that I know particularly our women of color specifically have said over and over. I think women in general have felt that they don't feel heard, but especially women of color have said over and over that they don't feel heard. And I think this is an example of what they mean when they say, I don't feel heard. I'm sharing my symptoms, my experience, and my
Mm-hmm.
experience is denounced, or it's undermined, or it's ignored, or it's devalued in some way. So we have this historic context where we have had research studies done on people of color against our will, putting our health at risk, putting our lives at risk. In gynecology, we've shared repeatedly the history of research being done on enslaved women without their permission, without pain, specifically surgical procedures being done without their permission and without pain relief. So very barbaric history of women's health, specifically when it comes to Black women. We know about the research that was done on Puerto Rican women, for where a lot of our information on birth control comes from. Again, targeting them because they were considered to be poor, uneducated, as a target group. We know about the Tuskegee study, but a lot of people don't talk about the Guatemalan study, which is very similar, and even in some sense worse, because people are actually intentionally infected with certain types of sexually transmitted infections. And so, given this long history, but this is the thing, like people always say, well, that was in the past. But then you fast forward to the pandemic experience, and the pandemic experience may have further impacted this level of distress, or perhaps you disagree. Do you think the relationship between people of color and the healthcare system worsened, improved, or stayed the same as a result of the pandemic?
I would say that it has improved in certain areas, but it has disclosed or uncovered other concerns. And what I mean by that is, just as you said, it really, we have to think about the question on where is the accountability, because the training comes from the institution. And sometimes the distrust and suspiciousness actually comes from the disconnect of understanding between the clinician, the practitioner, and the patient. So even if there is not a knowing of the historical, a neglect, medical abuse that has happened across, even in the psychological field, there's a lot of biased studies in regards to African American people of color, or not even including them.
Oh, we want to know.
Yeah. I can give an example. It was in the early 1900s that a famous psychoanalyst believed that African Americans did not dream dreams. And we were not actually considered to actually think deeply or unconsciously. So we weren't really afforded that position and ability. But in regards to the training and the responsibility, we have to really look at the alignment of how are clinicians trained? How are they retrained? What are, we all have CEUs, all of us, right?
Yes.
Diversity training, but
Mhm.
there has to be some sensitivity in regards to understanding that every individual is unique. And one of the points that I actually wanted to make before I pause is that for me, treating my patients, what I do see also is somatic disorders, suppressed anxiety, depressive disorders manifesting as physical symptoms. and physicians are treating that physical symptom. So what I actually do is try to correlate with the medical practitioner to actually really create a universal understanding of the patient as a whole person, because usually we're taught we have a criteria, we have, you know, things that needs to be met, we have our structure, but there has to be a human component to really understanding how we're showing up in that space, but also the ethnicity, the culture, the training, the unconscious bias of the practitioner. We want to really understand how to actually really treat distrust. A lot of us were not
Mm.
trained in
No,
that,
we're not. We're
right?
not
So
at
I'll
all.
pause there.
No, I need you to go there because, sometimes people say, how do we rebuild trust? And my comment is always the African American experience in the US when it comes to healthcare has never been one of trust. So
Mm,
the question is, how do you build trust in a society when there's overwhelming distrust? And so the African American experience, or the experience of the Black person in the US, and similarly other minority groups, is the fact that when you have an overarching theme of the governing of the body of people that seems to disenfranchise, marginalize consistently on every aspect of life, a particular group, even if every other aspect was perfected, or let's put it this way, even if healthcare was perfected, meaning we did not have disparities, we approach healthcare with equity. If you are living in a society where every other aspect of your life, your job, where you live, your access to funding for your businesses are all marginalized, and there's disparity in every aspect of your life, even with a perfect healthcare system, you're not going to trust the healthcare system because you're going to think, oh, it's got to be like everything else. And so how do you build trust in a system within a system that is so consistently marginalizing the same groups of people over and over again?
yeah.
How do you separate the two?
Well, that's a layered question. I would say it's going to take a lot of work, but one step at a time. And I think it really just goes back to training and accountability and building a little more sensitivity into the medical system, and to actually bring a little more humanist approach to it. You
Mhm.
may have to actually take time. Sometimes we have time limits of treating, we have a medication, we have procedures, but to really just build relationship with the patients, I think that we're missing the relationship part, the understanding, the choice, the compassion. And it does start at home too. We learn to trust and not trust, you know, as children growing up. But also the communities around us, the hospitals, the clinics, mental health care. It has to be around and available and accessible. And those that are in that position of help has to be accountable and open to building relationship and patience around fear, anxiety, but they're there for a reason. They also have hope, but they're going to have reservations. And how do we actually work with that? So I believe that even if we build that into the educational system as we train new clinicians, or actually retrain and keep us all accountable in our fields, maybe we'll be able to bring that human approach a little bit quicker to actually develop a sense of safety in a system. And that would be the first part. It's just training, awareness, accountability.
I definitely agree with you that we need to start at the training for the next generation, and maybe I like that little shade in there, the retraining of current clinicians. That was subtle, but I caught it. But here's the challenge, though. I think the couple things you touched on that I do want to touch on. One, you mentioned earlier, just seeing someone as a whole person. I think that's been the challenge, right, of the society, is that from inception, Black people were not seen as a whole person. So I think some of that mentality and some of that ideology continue to be generational and continue to affect the next generation. And hopefully we're seeing some changes in the attitude of the current generation that appears to be a lot more welcoming of diversity of people. But I definitely think that the inception of seeing enslaved people as less than has continued to transcend. Sorry?
I was saying permeate.
Permeate through generation after generation. The other thing I want to touch on that you said, I think part of the issue is, again, representation, right? So this active thinking and this progressive thinking that we're representing on this platform is probably because we're women of color and we've experienced the healthcare system from a certain lens. And the only way that this type of thinking, in my opinion, will go forth is if there are representation of people who have these particular lenses, who can give this different aspect of what it's like to be a patient in the skin, on these boards, on these medical boards, in these institutions of academia. But that's the other issue, is we're not even on these boards. We're not even in these critical positions to bring forth these perspectives and to make that particular change. So I think probably maybe step one, maybe diversifying these really critical roles. Leadership in hospitals, underrepresented severely in the E-suite. It's underrepresented for women, period, but it's especially underrepresented for minorities and certainly minority females. When you talk about research and who gets funded for research, who gets supported for NIH grants, it's always underrepresented. Fewer Blacks get supported, fewer Hispanics get supported. And so even the researchers, even if you have the perspective of understanding the importance of equitable representation in your study, you're less likely to get the funding that you need to do those studies. And so it definitely creates this whirlwind. But I would like to get to the point of, I may not be able to change the world right now, but how do I change the experience of the minority that comes before me that may not trust the system?
Develop the relationship with the patient. Be a trustworthy person for your patient and have that be the starting point. It means then that you are being an advocate for them. It means then that you may be having to step not out of your role, but go beyond just the basics at times to advocate for them, or even to empower them in terms of knowledge and the things like that. But I feel like that therapeutic alliance, so to speak, is probably one of the first places that you can start, or this is how you can make that change. And there's something to be said about reading the people. Not everybody's good at it, but reading the people to see as they present themselves, what do they need you to be for them? Right? So being able to pay attention and listen to what it is that they're saying and what it is that they're asking for, and being able to, and that I think is really the human part of it. It's being able to make that connection and see what is it that they need me to do, and then try to be and do that.
How do you do that in 15 minutes, Dr. Trissa? for every single, I love what you're saying. And let me tell you, there are so many times I go in with the heart of doing that. And then all I'm thinking is the pressure of the 15-minute clock.
Yeah. And I've had the lovely, have to do it with 4 in an hour. So yeah, I know it's much easier said than done. I have a slightly different dynamic now, so it makes it a little bit easier for me to do. You find the spaces, and I will be honest, do I do this with every single patient? No, definitely not. But there's some that need it more than others. Because I think it will also be a gross generalization to say that every person of color has this huge distrust against the system.
Mm-hmm.
So this may not be necessary for every single person that comes through your door,
Mm-hmm.
but it's being sensitive to know the ones that may need it.
But a lot of them do.
A lot.
Overwhelmingly. Mm-hmm.
A lot.
Yeah.
I treat my population tends to be a little bit more diverse is not the word, but definitely not as minority centric as could be.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So I mean, and that's interesting because you are a rarity, right? So in all of the
Yes.
fields, in all of these fields, as women of color, you know, in medicine it's 2%. I believe in psychology, you guys also have low numbers representation of Black women, and similarly in physical therapy. So we all represent fields that are underrepresented for who we are as women. And so, you know, the downside is, yeah, you work in a population that's not going to get the benefit of seeing the representation that they need. And that's a challenge because we can't be everywhere. You know, when you're dealing with only 2% of all doctors being Black females, then you will not have adequate representation on boards. You will not have adequate representation in research. You will not have adequate representation in any aspect of medicine because 2% is just too few. It doesn't even represent the equivalent numbers of Black women in the population. So there, and that's one thing, one of the struggles in women's health is that now, because of all the studies, especially the study that said that Black babies tend to survive better as if they're cared for by Black clinicians, right? But guess what? There's not enough Black clinicians who are pediatricians to take care of every single Black baby. And so we need a bigger, larger approach to this. Are there different avenues and other ways that we can approach this in terms of, so we talked about training clinicians, but is there a way that we can help the public directly to really at least consider these barriers, recognize them? Because a lot of people don't even recognize their own traumatic response.
Sure.
And, you know, I'm guilty of overusing the word trauma, but in this case, their traumatic response to the healthcare system or the historical seeds that have been planted because their grandmother was like, listen, don't trust those doctors out there, you know, because they had really bad experiences. So is there another approach we can take in addition to training our clinicians that may help the public itself to really start to contemplate these issues and address them?
Yes. And you know, what comes to mind as we think about that is education, information, but also assessment. And what I mean by that is because in regards to test construction, I also provide a lot of assessment. Assessment actually provides insight on the patient even before you see them. And even if we just simply create an intake assessment, we have intake, we want to know where their pain is, what their problem is, where their symptom is. But how amazing would it be to actually understand where their level of trust is? But also, and have that, well, what I will say is I'll use an example. There's a scale, as you know, Dr. Tasca.
I don't know if I know. You may have to test me.
Yes.
If I know.
Yes. 1 to 10, the happy face is how severe is your pain. But if we can actually put another scale on how much do you actually trust, right? We don't have to formulate it in that word or in that way, but really just to actually give clarity that we understand, we know, and we want to actually create a more comfortable relationship and understanding. But if you actually just briefly add that to the intake process in regards to how much do you trust, what is your level of comfort with a practitioner, but also provide education and templates on what fear, what anxiety is around, you know, historical medical trauma, suspiciousness. There's so many different ways to actually ease a patient's anxiety within that 15 minutes, I would say. So it's just really giving them the information that connects to understanding so they can understand what they're feeling and to actually understand that we understand if you're coming in with a position of suspicion or worry.
I definitely like the idea of confronting that. I will definitely say from the perspective of it's really hard to fit something else in 15 minutes. Let me tell y'all, between the EMR and all the EMR requirements that we have to input, and this is something I really want to do, but it's very pressured, and we're talking about clinicians that are, we walk in that line when it comes to mental health because of the high rates of substance abuse and the high rates of suicide in the medical field. I think, additional pressures without the support of the system itself is going to be challenging. Because even now we go over 15 minutes all the time. By the time my pregnant patients go to the bathroom, they get their vitals done, they come in, they doing their PHQ-9 one day, GAD-7 another day, they're having an exam of the baby, we're talking about their high risk issues, we're planning out. There is so much that we're trying to put into this 15 minutes, but I agree with you that that assessing, because none of this matters, right? Like if they don't trust us, then they don't care what we say about their vital signs, what we say about their laboratory results, what we say about the assessment of their pregnancy. It's very important to foster this relationship.
In 15 minutes.
Yes. Like it's like, and it's really sad, I think, because so many of us, at least the people I know, have come across from my medical school training to my residency training, we go into these fields wanting to really change and help people change their lives for the better. And then we walk into these systems that have been created that are based on capitalism, and everything comes down to the numbers, because that's really what the 15 minutes come from. A lot of people don't understand why 15 minutes exists. We don't choose 15 minutes. We want to spend time with our patients. I used to really fantasize about having the relationships that the older clinicians used to have, where they knew the whole family. They would even sometimes gather with their patients. And it was just all these, things that we would consider inappropriate nowadays, because, our system has changed and evolved into different ways. But I really like that relationship building, where I think it takes time to build relationships, and it's really hard to rush that process. But when you are in a system that tells you only have a limited amount of time, it's really hard to build a relationship when both you and the patient feel that clock ticking, right? And outside of that, you then have to, at the same time, take care of a very critically ill group, because our society is sicker. There's way more mental health. I don't know if we're screening better or if we're just have a higher prevalence. There is way more diabetics, way more obesity issues, way more hypertensive issues post-pandemic. So it's you have this we don't have enough practitioners for mental health. I tell you that I'm struggling to have mental health providers for my perinatal depression patients. And so the system is overwhelmed. And I don't know what it's going to take to get to the top to say, we need y'all to revalue human life. Because if you revalue human life, then your calculation will be way different, right? It won't be based on the dollar. And I understand, and I'm not coming from an unrealistic perspective by not understanding that there's a cost to medicine and a cost that's not regulated. Don't come at me with the socialism. I'm just saying there's a cost to medicine, and they got to pay for this and they got to pay for that. And they got to keep the lights open. Our system is, has issues on many levels. And so I understand the need to figure that out. But I feel like if we can figure out all of the technology that we are doing now, and we have Chat GPT and all these other things coming, then we have the individuals who are presently on this earth with the intellectual prowess to come up with a way to make this system work. We just have not valued human life. And I think that's the ultimate issue.
Yeah. And, it's sad, but it's true. But also, what I think also is important, Dr. Tasca, as we understand our limitations, it's so important that we as practitioners or therapists or medical doctors, we have to take care of ourselves as well. And We have to show up in spaces that we can and be more intentional, and also encourage those that are coming behind us to actually show up in those rooms, show up in those schools, and increase the attendance and interest of individuals wanting to become therapists, wanting to become medical doctors. We do need more African American male physicians, female physicians, therapists, psychologists. So, we just encourage one another, but also show up when it's time to show up, and to actually be intentional, to go to those boardrooms unapologetically, create your own, network, and create
Mhm.
your own hospital network and organization. We're builders. We can do it. But I just wanted to stress that point because we do
Mhm.
take on a lot of stress
Mhm.
and seeing the deficits, but we have to be mindful of taking care of ourselves as well.
Yeah, yeah. You're 100% right because the numbers are showing that we don't currently.
Mhm.
We don't currently. Yeah. It's kind of like when you have an iceberg, you're like, where, at what part of the iceberg do I start chipping things away? Because so many aspects of health is so interconnected. And it's like, well, what about representation here? In order to have representation here, you need representation there. In order to have representation there, you need representation on Capitol Hill. In order to have representation on Capitol Hill, it snowballs in a way. But you're absolutely right. I think it's one of the things that I've said on different talks that I've had is being okay with not seeing the end result of your participation in the movement.
Mm.
And I think oftentimes we are tied to wanting to see the change now. Like I'm doing this now because I want to see the evidence of my efforts now. And the truth of the matter is that this change may likely be and has been multi-generational. So it's very possible that the efforts that we place in now, showing up in those boardrooms, showing up on Capitol Hill, showing up in these spaces, that you have to be okay with not necessarily being present to see the end result of that effort. And I think for a society that's so focused on immediate gratification, that's a hard pill to swallow, no pun intended. That's a hard pill to swallow that you mean I may not see the change, but I really want to see this change.
Mhm.
Yeah,
But we may not.
yeah. Well, it just starts with one step. Those that were before us are reasons why we're here together speaking about it. So we may not see the promised land right now, per se,
Mhm, mhm. But I
but
feel like they were better at this than we are when it comes to gratification. I feel like our whole society has been so built on immediate gratification now. And I think
Mhm.
it's harder for our generation than that. I think it's doable because they did it. I mean, Lord, they did it,
yes,
right?
yes. And they had many more adversities. So, yes, I have hope. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm hopeful. I just, who is the
Reality, too.
yes. I am hopeful. I am hopeful, but I am also hoping that we can get, I think if we had more clinicians who look like us who are doing this research, you know what? I have to take that back because Dr. Corbett, a Black female primary investigator on the vaccine project, and still even her as the mouthpiece for the project and the face of the project, and certainly the key investigator and the brains of the project, there's still a lot of people of color who don't trust the vaccine. So I can't even say that us as primary investigators are going to make that much of a difference because people are like, yeah, but she works for the government, but she has to do what they say to do. Oh, we can't trust her because maybe she's paid to not tell us the truth about the vaccine. There were so many suspicions and so many uh
Conspiracy theories.
thank you, there were so many conspiracy theories behind even her, even no matter what she said, no matter how clearly she said it, no matter how much she proved she is intellect, and granted, there was some racism behind it because folks didn't trust that a Black woman was behind it, but that's a whole other conversation. But no matter what she said to our community specifically, there was still so much doubt behind it. So I gotta take it back. I can't even say just having us as investigators is going to make a difference. But I definitely don't want to leave without saying the importance of knowing more about us scientifically. Like, how can I treat us as Black people and understand why we are not making more advances with sickle cell? Why are we also more disproportionately affected by hypertension? What is it different about us? Do hypertensive meds work the same in our bodies? What is it about us in preeclampsia? In order for us, why do Black women have so many more fibroids, or is more likely to have be affected by fibroids and endometriosis and PCOS? Without the research, we will never be able to answer these questions. And that's the hard part about it, is because you understand the historical context and why there's this trust from people of color when it comes to research. But on the other hand, people of color are also frustrated that we don't feel medicine adequately cares for us, but we don't have the information about us scientifically to be able to care for us properly. So it's
catch-22.
Yes,
much.
That's a whole nother topic too, and that I hope you open up space for, because there's a lot there. There's so much there. And what I will say just very briefly is that we also have to take in a context the sociocultural climate at the time that's creating fear and anxiety. And what I mean by that, especially with the doctor you just mentioned, Dr. Tasca, is that there was a hypervigilance and a fear response because of what was already happening. But there was also there was a lot of tension in regards to the political environment. So there was a fight and flight and fear response. It was a lot of obsessions around death and loss. And, there was so much that created that resistance to her. So I think that situation is unique, but we do have to actually look at what is happening all around, not just in the medical field, but also what is contributing. Social media, right? And so there's just so much there, but I'm so happy you mentioned that, because yes.
It's very, very layered. Oh my goodness. Well, we have to have a part 2, like she said, because I feel like there's so many other things I could say about this whole topic. But that being said, we're just going to keep you wanting more from us. Okay. So we thank you guys for watching. Dr. Black, people are still trying to line up at your door and to sit on your couch. Where can they find you?
Yes. So you can find me at drtamelapractice.com, which is my website, and all of my information is on there.
And you can feel free to text me also, because y'all have already been texting me. And I will give you the information as well. Dr. Trissa, folks are trying to get their pelvic muscles together and understand what is the difference between pelvic floor issues with Black women and other races and ethnicities. And if they want to find out that information, where can they find you?
They can find me at trissajob.dpt.
Awesome. On Instagram. That's right. And I am Dr. T, the hand behind the handle of Healthy Bump Club on Instagram and Healthy Bump Club right here on YouTube. We thank you guys for watching. And if you enjoyed this talk, believe me, we talked about other aspects of disparity in medicine on so many other topics that we did before, because this topic is very, very layered, impacts, as you can see, every aspect of healthcare, from our mental health to our physical health, okay, and to our nutritional health. Okay, we didn't go into that aspect, but it is what it is. And if you want to continue to participate in these topics, make sure you comment, like, and share. and hit us up on our platforms. And if you want to financially support us, first of all, let us just say thank you for financially supporting us. You can go ahead and purchase one of our gear, or you can go ahead and use our Apple link, our Apple partnership link. Put on some soca and some soca size for a little bit, put on a little bit of sweat. Ain't nothing like soca to really get your cart pumping. Nonetheless, we want you to come back and join us for the next episode, and we will see you when? We'll see you then. Next episode. Bye.
Bye.